All right, open your eyes. First, I would like to ask anybody out here to describe this quilt. Don't say anything. Is anybody willing to describe color, shape? What's the main color you see? Green. And another one? Gold. And maybe a third color? Black. So this quilt is green, gold, and black. Alex, would you agree with that? No. Alex disagrees. Okay. Alex, would you be willing to describe, without moving, what you see this quilt as being? Green, blue, orange, red, pink, black, yellow, purple. There's a lot of patterns and a lot of colors. Do you believe him? Well, that's nice of you. Thank you. Would you be frustrated if they didn't believe you? All right, you're the only one who gets to do this. Alex, come around and look at the front of. Can you see what they see?
Yes.
Is it different from what you see?
Yes.
Do you believe him?
Yes.
What if you've been taught that you couldn't believe him? That he was not believable? No. How would you feel if you shared your perspective and they said, we don't believe you? Kind of mad. Well, let's turn around, Vicki. This is your sermon illustration for today. Thank you, Vicki.
Oh, and here I thought it was a parting gift.
I'm going to put this here for now. Thank you so much, Alex. They did not plan on doing this. I wanted to show this example because to me this is a beautiful example of the way that humans can see a truth differently because of where they're positioned in life. It is a big truth, and I use the example of what if you didn't believe him, because guess what? There are people that we've been taught to believe less than others, who see something differently than we do, but we often dismiss their perspective, even though he was 100% telling the truth. The quilt isn't just one side or the other, is it? It was both. And what if that quilt represents God? What if that quilt represents the Bible? What if it represents theology, politics, or simply the experience of living on this planet? Wouldn't it be to the benefit that we have people who are on all the sides and we talk to each other and we all believe each other? That would be to the benefit of us actually seeing what's real. So I did an experiment quite a few years ago. I went into my office here at Atonement, and I looked at all the books that I'd voluntarily purchased and read in the last 15 years or so of my ministry, books that I had not been told to read in seminary. And these are wonderful books by authors who I love: Richard Rohr, Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, lots of great authors. But I decided to just do a thought experiment. I counted up the total. Let's say there were 60. And then I decided to see how many of them were by women or someone who was Black or Hispanic, not the white male majority. And out of that, there was only like 6 books. That was really interesting to me. Now, I loved practically every single one of these books, and it was great, but it was green. This keeps you warm, it's beautiful, it's lovely, but I was missing all of this. Does that make sense? So I asked other pastors, what are books from various different authors, different perspectives, different backgrounds that you found really helpful? And they gave me a bunch of ideas. And one of the ideas that was on my reading list for many years, which finally the summer series encouraged me to read, was this book by Pastor and Professor James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So he's the first person I want to talk about today. Pastor James Cone, I had never heard about till I came to Atonement. It had never been brought up in my seminary education. Now, I loved my seminary education, but it was very green, if you catch my meaning. Wonderful seminary education, but then, so this was a person who lived and worked and spoke and wrote in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. And I believe he passed in like 2018 or something. You probably have it on your insert. There you go. So he was a professor, and in this book, he said, you know what? I've grown up in America, and I've been trained in theology, and you know what I've noticed? That not a single white Christian theologian or pastor has linked the brutality of what has happened to black people in this country with the cross. He says, it's so obvious to me. When we tell the story every Sunday and every Easter, we talk about an innocent man who had an unfair trial, was judged to be guilty of something he was innocent of, who was brutally beaten and put on a cross for everybody to see for the purpose of terrorizing the people. Crosses were put outside of the city so that when you walked into the city, you'd see the power of the Roman government, and it would encourage you to keep your mouth shut and your head down so that you knew who was in power. This is historical fact. He said, how is it in the decades of things like this happening to black people in our country that no one has figured it out? Now, I'm going to share something that is not comfortable for us, and that's one of the things I realized as I began to read books from people whose perspectives were different from mine, that there was discomfort in what they would say, but it was a holy discomfort. It was things I needed to hear. And so many times when I would read books from other women authors, black authors, Hispanic, this is what would come out of my mouth. I never thought of that before. Of course. I grew up on the green side of the quilt. And they were telling me about things from the purple and the red side of the quilt. Of course I'd never thought of it before. That wasn't my fault. But it's up to me then to listen to what they have to say. So, in this book, he spends quite a bit of time talking about how after slavery was made illegal, there was no effort in our country to actually go deep and to talk about the perspectives that white people had that would have made slavery okay, that dehumanized black people. And white people in the South especially were very used to having that power over, and were threatened by black people having power, starting to be their own person. And this began a very horrible time in our American history called the lynching era, in which, in order to keep black people terrorized, any perceived infraction, whether it was looking someone in the eye or not crossing over to the other side of the street, a white person could accuse a black person, and that was it. And here's the even creepier part. Historically, on a Sunday morning in white churches, after church, they would all go to the park and watch this happening. Take pictures, make postcards, and send it to their family. Can you imagine? That's evil. It's evil. White supremacy is evil, and its fruits are evil. And no one noticed this. No one talked about this. No one said, how is this any different from what is happening to black people in our country, from what happened to the Native Americans? No one was talking about this. So James Cone did. He wrote this book, and he made this connection, and he called out a very prominent white theologian who's very, very well known in pastoral circles for the fact that he would sort of generally say racism is bad, but he had no skin in the game. He never, ever really got into the trenches of walking with black pastors and black people. He lived the professor he was calling out, Richard Niebuhr, worked at Union Theological Seminary, which was right next to Harlem in New York, and he never once went to a black church, never once sat and talked with black pastors. That was fascinating for me to read that. And also, if you remember several weeks ago when we talked about Bonhoeffer spent a year at Union Theological Seminary, and he went to Harlem and was impressed by the black churches and spent time with them and thought that they represented Christianity more than the white churches he went to. So, interesting. Of course, when this book was published, how do you think it was received by his fellow white theologians and pastors? They were mad, angry, furious. They said it's completely unfair to connect Jesus' horrible death on the cross with what happened to black people. The irony is, or rather the blessing, is that now, in 2025, I didn't know this came from James Cone, and I have heard this come from very, very many pastors on Good Friday, white pastors across our country. So this once very uncomfortable truth, this uncomfortable connection that Pastor James Cone made, is a little bit more common theology now. It's had some time to settle in, thank goodness. James Cone writes, I read the scriptures from the bottom. That is, I read the scriptures from the vantage point of the weak, the poor, and the helpless. I think that's the dominant theme in Scripture. I think you see that in Amos and the other prophets. I think you see that in Exodus, in the story of Jesus' life, and certainly in the cross. I think you have to read the Scripture through the eyes of those who are marginal, weak, and helpless in this society. So then there's Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, I was looking for someone to also complement James Cone. And she is a black woman lesbian writer who is a professor of English. And she wrote a lot in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and eventually succumbed to breast cancer. But in the 70s, she had a really interesting awakening. This is her book, Sister Outsider. She had a really interesting awakening. She had her first breast cancer scare, in which she was told by the doctors that in 3 weeks they would do surgery to find out if her breast cancer was malignant or benign. And if it was malignant, they told her to sort of prepare for the end. So in those 3 weeks, can you imagine what your brain is going through? And she had some fascinating observations that growing up as a black woman and growing up and then coming into her identity as well as a lesbian, she realized that she'd spent so much time censoring herself and trying to fit into a world that always saw her as wrong. And she was afraid so much, and she held so much oppression and anger within her. And then she realized, if I'm gonna die, do I wanna die with all of that in me? Wait a minute, we're all gonna die eventually. We're all afraid of various things in life. Why don't I just make sure that I speak my mind and say what needs to be said so that at least I die feeling like I got it out? And so she began writing and speaking with a brilliance and a pointedness that is fascinating to watch. Talk about someone who's willing to make people uncomfortable in a holy way. This is one of her quotes. I was going to die sooner or later, whether or not I had even spoken myself. My silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. What are the words you do not yet have? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you will sicken and die of them still in silence? We have been socialized to respect fear more than our own need for language. Boom. The other thing I found powerful about her writing is that as she was talking to anyone and everybody who would want her to speak, she was writing about the manner in which we move forward in a good way. And much like Martin Luther King Jr., who said, look, if our end goal is everybody living in peace and harmony and there being justice for all people, then the means, the journey toward that has to mirror that to some degree. And so she was really good at pointing out all the ways in which various people were not doing that. And she talks about the master's tools. This is a brilliant sentence. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. As I was in text study with other pastors this last week, one of them brought up this great story of Jesus with the Syrophoenician woman. And if you don't remember that off the top of your head, I'm just going to briefly summarize it. Jesus was trying to get rest from his ministry, so he moved out of Jewish territory into Gentile territory, thinking he was going to be left alone. But a Syrophoenician woman found him. This is a woman who is a Gentile, not a Jew. She came into the house and she said, Jesus, my daughter is dying. I need you to cure her. Please cure her. And Jesus says this thing that makes us all uncomfortable. He says, I've come for the children of Israel, not for you. But she persists and says, yes, but even the dogs will eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And Jesus says, you just taught me something. You showed me, this is Pastor Siri's paraphrase. Don't find it in the Bible if you hadn't figured that out. Jesus in his mind is going, you have shown me where the culture and the master's tools still lie inside of me. Jesus, wanted to create a world where the love and the presence of God was felt universally, and all people were welcome to that table. And he hadn't seen that blind sight that was still in him, and she revealed it. And a normal person, especially a rabbi, might have gone, how dare you speak to me, woman? Get out of here. That would have been perfectly normal, but not Jesus. So to me, the power of the story is not that Jesus said something that could be considered racist or exclusionary, but rather that he allowed a woman to change his mind. And he said, you're right. Go, your daughter's healed. And some people argue that after that, Jesus spends more time with the Gentiles than he did before. So there you go. A woman changed Jesus' mind. To me, that is a beautiful case, a beautiful explanation for who Audre Lorde is. She is a woman who culturally had no power and was reviled. And she has so many stories that she shares in her book of little things from the time she was a little girl, of how people would look at her in a way she didn't understand until she internalized, it must be me, there's something wrong with me. But then her anger taught her, no, it's not me, it's the world. The world has been taught a craziness and a hatred, and I'm not going to be quiet anymore. I'm going to point out every single infraction of where we are sick and where we are wrong, because this is not the world as it could be. She was the Syrophoenician woman grabbing on Jesus' chair saying, no, I am worthy and my daughter is worthy of being healed too. And maybe we can learn from Jesus in that moment and not act like other people who know better. But maybe we can have the humility to realize that on the other side of this quilt, there's color. And that's what Jesus did, and that's what we're called to do too. When somebody comes from a life perspective that is different than ours, it is not our fault that we don't see the world the same way they do. But it is our responsibility to listen if we want a world that honors diversity, that sees it all as expressions of God. And if we want a world where we collaboratively work together, not in spite of our differences, but because of our differences, to make a world that is just for all. When we have a church community, we do not expect you to assimilate and all become exactly the same, to think the same, to dress the same, to act the same, to be the same, to believe the same. But rather, we come in with our uniqueness that God made us to be, our unique perspectives, and together we are better through those differences, through those abilities to see. I'm going to share one more quote by Audre Lorde that I think is a really good holy disruptor quote. Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their actions. There is a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. So her invitation is not to wait to be taught, but to go out and start seeking, to start asking questions, to start reading what is already out there for us to broaden our hearts and minds. And not to make it someone else's problem to say, hey, you're the one person with a disability I know. Now it's your job to educate me. Nope, it isn't. There are so many people who have availed themselves to that, who have written and spoken and said, yes, I want to share that perspective. Those are the people that we can find everywhere if we're willing to look. And that is part of our holy work, to allow ourselves to be disrupted by other people for the sake of learning and growth. And the last thing I want to say that Audre Lorde wrote, which was profound, is she said, one of the things she notices when black women and white women would get together to talk about feminism is that if black women started to speak about how their particular unique experience as black women was difficult and sometimes made harder by white women, the white women would often feel guilty and it would end the conversation. And she said, I have no time for guilt. It doesn't work. Look, we've all been taught a distorted view of reality and each other. It's not our fault. It's like breathing in smoke from a wildfire nearby. You can't really help it. So get rid of the guilt and just admit, I'm breathing in smoke. All right, let's fix it. Let's get in the air purifiers. Let's do the thing. Let me clean off my glasses. Like Jesus, woman, you're right. Your daughter is now healed. It is not our fault we have distorted views of one another, but it is our responsibility to move forward together, to see more accurately the beautiful tapestry that God has made and how that can enrich us if we work together. Amen.